So this first chapter is going to talk about statistical errors that get made. You know, the tests that we just have been doing will reject or fail to reject a claim. Well, what happens if we reject something and we weren't supposed to reject it? Okay, so that's what we need to discuss. What does that mean? So when you run a statistical test and you get your null hypothesis, you are supposed to get the sample that correctly leads you to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, but sometimes you get one of those samples that is statistically unlikely. One of those samples that is in the, that was less than a 5% chance of getting. But if there's less than a 5% of chance of getting something, could you still get it? Yes, you could still get a sample out there. Then that would lead you to draw a conclusion about the null hypothesis that is wrong. I want to give you a picture of that before we go into that any further. So here's what the picture of this might look like, and then we'll discuss the rules. So everybody get ready to draw. You got your normal model here. Okay. We've got our null hypothesis, which is the claim. Okay, we've got our null hypothesis, which is the claim. And then, let's say this is an upper tail problem. Okay, so upper tail problem, I'm going to have let's say this is alpha. And what's the default for alpha? 0.05. So that means I got 5% shaded area right here. Okay? So if the null hypothesis is true, then all the data is located here. So I'm going to draw myself some samples. If the null hypothesis is true, then all the data is centered right around this claim. And hey, do you remember, why do we get all these different kinds of samples? Do you remember what that's called? Variability. Good. Sampling variability. Excellent. Now, all that data is around there, and those are not unusual samples. Those just happening because you got a different sample than I did. Sampling variability happens because you got different data than me. Okay? So we're going to get different samples. Well, we're going to get different samples, and there are some samples out here. I mean, that's a legit sample that is out there. So what happens is, if the null hypothesis is true, but I happened to get a rare sample. I happened to get a rare sample. And where is that rare sample located? What is that pink area called? What am I going to do if a sample's in that area? I'm going to reject. You remember that this area, the alpha, is the size of the rejection region. So the sample that I got happened to fall in the rejection region. And so even though the null hypothesis is true, and the data, most of the data is located right around it, I got a rare sample out there in Narnia that allowed me, that's in the rejection region, and I happened to get a rare sample that led me to reject HO. We rejected that hoe and we weren't supposed to. Okay? We rejected that hoe and we were not supposed to. Okay? So, let's see here. Let me take a look at up here in the definition. Okay? So, when we do these problems, here's the way we're going to think about it. The reality is, we'll always think in terms of the reality is, the HO is true. But we got a sample That is statistically unlikely, and it gives us evidence to reject the null hypothesis, even though we're not supposed to. But we think that HO should be rejected. Okay? If the HO is rejected, what does that say about the alternative? What are we then saying about the alternative? Now, if we reject HO, we have evidence that HA is true. So we're, in a sense, saying HA is true, but is it really? No, I told you the reality is what? HO is true, but I got a sample that made me think it was not, and I think HA is true. That's a problem. That's a mistake. And we're going to do a real example and show you what that means. So here's we'll sing a song first. Okay, here we go. Let's do this one. If the null is really true, and we get a sample that causes us to reject the null, that's a type 1 error. Type 1 error. Type 1 error. If the null is really true, and we get a sample that causes us to reject the null, that's a type 1 error. Type 1 error. Type 1 error. Okay. Oh, see, I wish I had. I need to pull that meme up and put that here in a little presentation. It's, of course, Ryan Gosling, so that makes it all that much better. And it says, "Hey girl, I shouldn't have rejected you," or something like that. Wait, what is it? It said, let's go back. Okay, here it is. "Hey girl, okay, here we go. I think I made a type 1 error. I shouldn't have rejected you." That's what it says. "Hey girl, I think I got a type 1 error. I shouldn't have rejected you." So he rejected you and he shouldn't have. He thinks he made a type 1 error. Okay? "Hey girl, I shouldn't have rejected you." Okay? All right. So let's actually put this into context. Oh, before we do type 2, go on to the next page and let's do an example of this before we go on to the type 2. Here we go. All right. So here we go. A shipment of parts has arrived, and you are the person that works at the shipment dock. You have to decide whether or not to accept the shipment. The manufacturing company the parts are shipped from says that the specification for the parts in the shipment show a mean of 2 inches. If you find that the shipment does not meet specifications, you're going to send the entire shipment back. Okay? All right, so let's talk about what happens. The null hypothesis. Is it on the next page? Yes. It's on the bottom of the next page. Okay, so our null hypothesis says what? Our null hypothesis says, so here's our HO. It says the average length of the parts in the shipment, so here comes the shipment, the average length is 2 inches. The alternative would say that the average length is not 2 inches. Okay, so we understand this problem. What are you going to do if this is true? If the null is true, what are you going to do with the shipment? If you're the person working at the docks and the shipment is averaging 2 inches, what will you do for your company? No. You will accept the shipment. You will accept the shipment, not to be confused with the null hypothesis. I mean, we're going to let our company keep that shipment of parts. Okay? Okay, so that's what we're going to do if HO is true. If HO is true, we're going to accept the shipment of parts. If it's not true and the alternative is true, the alternative says the average is not equal to 2. What are you going to do if the shipment is faulty and the average of the parts is not equal to 2? What are you going to do with all that whole shipment? You're going to send the parts back to the manufacturer. Okay, so we need to understand that first before we start. So there's what your job is to determine if you should accept those parts or send them back to the manufacturer. All right, so here we go. In context, define a type 1 error. So a type 1 error happens when what? The reality is that the null hypothesis is true. Okay, so what does that mean in context of this problem? If the reality is the null hypothesis is true, so what can you tell me? The parts are good and we should accept the shipment. Good. The parts are good and we should accept the shipment. Okay? But guess what? We got a really rare sample that makes us think that HO is false and we should reject it. What happens if we think HO is false and we reject it? What do? We send the parts back. We think they are bad and we send the parts back. We think the parts are bad, parts are faulty, and we send the parts back. So that's what's happening. Hey parts, I shouldn't have rejected you. Okay? Instead of hey girl. Hey parts, I think I made a type 1 error. I shouldn't have rejected you. Okay? But you did. So up at the top of the next page, what is the bad thing about that? Who gets hacked off with you sending the parts back even though you should have accepted them? The manufacturer. Perfect. So the manufacturer that sent you those parts is pretty ticked off that you rejected his shipment even though it was good. So the manufacturer is mad because you send back parts that are good. Okay? So you got your manufacturer mad at you. It's going to waste his money because he's going to have to get back another whole shipment to send you another one whenever the first one was absolutely fine. Okay? That's when what? Oh, yeah, then he might just send the same shipment back. Okay, good. So that's a type 1 error. Type 1 error. So now let's talk about the other kind, and that'll be the last thing for the day. Type 2 error. Type 2 error. So a type 2 error, the null hypothesis is actually false. So the null hypothesis is false. So you should reject it. Yeah, good. The reality is HO is false, and you should reject it. You are supposed to find evidence far enough away, and you are supposed to reject it. But you got a rare sample. It was statistically unlikely. You got a rare sample, and that rare sample did not give you enough evidence to reject. Okay? Think about it this way. O.J. Simpson. The null hypothesis is he's innocent. Okay? And I think that that's false. So I'm supposed to reject him, but I got a rare sample that I didn't have enough evidence to reject. So I think HO is true, and I fail to reject. I think the null hypothesis is true because my rare sample, and I failed to reject it. Let's show you what that looks like. So I think the HO is true. The reality is it's false, but I get a sample that makes me think it's true. Here's what it looks like. You have two curves this time. You need to have an overlapping curve. So let's draw an overlapping curve here. Okay? So here is the null hypothesis that is claimed, and according to this type 2 error, it is false. Okay? So the data is not located in that curve. The data is not, I'm not going to draw my p-hats in that curve on the left because the null hypothesis is not true. So there's no data here. Okay, no data there because the null hypothesis is false. Okay, here's your alternative. You telling me it's actually higher or whatever, and it's true. The reality, it's true. So I get all my samples in there. So let's draw some samples. So all the samples are centered around the alternative. Here is where all your data is. Your data is not around the null. Your data is not around the null hypothesis. Why is your data not around the null hypothesis? Thank you. Because the null hypothesis is false. So there's no data around the null hypothesis. It's all out here around the alternative. Okay? Let's put ourselves an alpha in there, a rejection region. Let's say it's really low. Here's my rejection region, my lowest 5%. There's where I'm going to reject. Okay? Well, guess what? Guess where one of my samples happened to fall? Guess where the sample I've got was? You know, there's samples all around here. Boom! I got that one right there. It is in, oh no, the sample I got was statistically unlikely to have it. It was rare, and I got it over there in the rejection region. And look at how close it is. Look at how close it is to the null hypothesis. I mean, so what am I going to end up doing? What am I going to end up doing with the you know what? I shouldn't have drawn a rejection region for the alternative, so that was my bad. So can we just back up real quick? Yeah. Sorry. Okay. I know we're too close to that time. Sorry. We don't have a rejection region over here, so let's get rid of that. Okay, sorry. I know it's going to be in the video, but that's okay. Fixing that. Sorry, my bad. Because, yeah, I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I had a rejection region. Here's the rejection region. The rejection region always has to do with the null hypothesis. Why did I put it for the alternative? I don't know. Okay? Silly me. So all of this data here would cause me to reject the null hypothesis. And I'm supposed to, right? Why am I supposed to reject the null? Because it's false. Thank you. I'm kind of taking too long here and losing track. So all of those pieces of data are going to allow me to reject the null, and I'm supposed to, but I got this little rare sample right here. That's the deal. I got that little sample right there, and is that sample in the rejection region? No. So what do I do with my null hypothesis? I do not reject HO. So doesn't that stink? The null is false, and I don't reject it. That's the problem. The null hypothesis is false, but I ended up not rejecting it. The null hypothesis is false, and I ended up not rejecting it. Okay, so our song is going to go like this. It's called a type 2 error. I'll get it for you here in a second, but let me go through the words. So it's going to cause me to, see, I fail to reject this false null hypothesis. I fail to reject a false null hypothesis. So I don't reject a false null hypothesis when I should. I fail to reject a false null hypothesis. Type 2 error. See this sample? It gave me no evidence. This sample did not give me the evidence I needed to reject the null hypothesis. I had no evidence. So I failed to reject the false null hypothesis. Type 2 error, type 2 error. Okay, so let's try this now. Here we go. Type 2 error. Oh, type 2 error. Type 2 error. Cause we to fail to reject the false null hypothesis. Type 2 error. Type 2 error. Evidence. Oh, no evidence. No evidence. Cause we to fail to reject the false null hypothesis. Type 2 error. Type 2 error. Hey, wait, here's the meme. I don't know what you call that face, but look, it says type 2 error. Why you no reject the null? Why you no reject the null? Because you're supposed to, see? See, type 2 error, why you no reject the null? There you go. Why you no reject the null? You're supposed to. But you failed to reject a false null hypothesis. Okay. So we are so almost finished here, guys. I'm sorry I've got one little mess up there. Let's do this problem here about our manufacturing. Okay, you ready? So here we are, about to our parts. I know, we're here with our parts again. Okay, you're on the dock. Here comes a shipment, and the null hypothesis is false. Okay, here comes a shipment, and the null hypothesis is false. What does it mean if the null hypothesis is false? What should I do if the null is false? I should reject it. And what should I do with my parts? I should be sending them back. But guess what? I'm going to fail to reject them.
Type 2 error.
Yeah, so here we go. So the reality is, I actually like to say HA is true. Not the alternative. HA is true because the HO is false. Which meant HA is true. So the reality is, I have got bad parts. Okay? But what do I think? So the reality is, I have got bad parts. But what do I think? I fail to reject. So I do not reject the bad parts. So what do I think? If I don't reject the bad parts, what am I thinking? Good. I think the parts are good. Okay, so there you go. You see what's happening? So, I got bad parts. That's the reality. But I got a sample that makes me to think the parts are okay. So what is a consequence of that? Yeah, very good. My company, because of the error, My company accepts bad parts. What if these are brake parts for a car? Then you're going to be sending out you're putting these bad parts into your cars, and you got some lawsuits coming on. Okay? What type of error would you, the shipment inspector, the one who's at the docks, what kind of error do you think is one that you really want to avoid? Good. You want to avoid type 2 because what's happening if you have a type 2 error? You accept bad parts. That's bad. You could lose your job. I don't know. Lawsuits. If you got brake parts and you think they're good and they're really bad, you get all these lawsuits and that kind of thing. Okay? Hey, now that we've walked through that very carefully, let's do this one more example real quickly and then we'll be done. Okay? All right, but it'll go a lot faster now that we already know all the stuff we need to know. So here we go. Only about 20% of people who try to quit smoking succeed. Sellers of a motivational tape think that listening to the recorded message will help people quit smoking. So, the null hypothesis is the proportion of people who successfully quit smoking after listening to the motivational tape is 20%. So, I'm going to do this. That might help us. How about we do some shortcut stuff there? So the null hypothesis is we think that the proportion of people who successfully quit is still 20%. We want to see if we have evidence that the motivational tapes are doing what? Helping more people quit smoking. So how will that alternative look? Yeah. We want to see if we increase the proportion of people that quit smoking. Okay? All right. What? Yes, that is HA. Thank you, ma'am. That's my HA. Thank you. All right, so here we go. Do the context of this. Type 1 error, what's reality? Wait, let's just write. The reality is HO is what? True. Okay? What does that mean if HO is true? Okay. So P is still 20%. Are the motivational tapes helping? No. Just in general, it's 20% before the motivational tapes. We're going to see if the motivational tapes increase people quitting. The reality is the null hypothesis is true. The motivational tapes are not increasing. But we think, but what do we think? Yeah, we think that the proportion of people that quit smoking is greater than 20%. We think that the tapes work, and they actually do what? But they actually do not work. The tapes do not work, but we got information that makes us think that they do. Okay, so let me clarify that up here. See, if you say P is 20%, then the tapes do nothing. See, that's what's going on here. If the P is still 20%, the tapes are not doing anything. What happens if P is greater than 20%? What are the tapes doing? Then the tapes help. Okay, so that's what's going on. All right, so what's the consequence of the tapes not working, but we get evidence to think they are? What's going to happen in the real world? The tapes don't work, but we think that they do. What happens? What if you go to the store? You think the tapes work, but they don't actually. What's going to happen? Thank you. People waste money. People waste money buying tapes that don't work. There we go. Now you got it. buying tapes that do not work. Okay, so let's try the next one. Type 2, okay. Type 2. What's the rule for type 2 error? Reality is what? Okay, so the reality is HO is false. It's a false null hypothesis, type 2 error, type 2 error. So the reality is HA is true. What does it mean if HA is true? If you look back at the okay, hold on, let's look. There we go. If HA is true, then what does that tell us? The tapes are working. Okay, good. So if the reality is HA is true, so the tapes work. And P is now greater than 0.20. The proportion that quit smoking is greater than 0.20. Good job. Okay, that's reality, but it's a type 2 error. So what do we think? We think P is still 0.20, and we think that the tapes don't work. So we think the tapes don't work, but they actually do. Yeah, so the consequence is maybe the manufacturer doesn't even make the tapes. So people lose out on something that could potentially help them. So manufacturer quits making the tapes. Quits making the tapes. And people don't get help, and they could. Yeah? People don't get help, and they could. So the reality is the tapes work, but we think that they don't. So if you were the marketing director for the company that sells the motivational tapes, okay, so think of your job. You're the one who sells the motivational tape. What type of error would you prefer to be made? Okay, let's look. Type 1 says, people waste money buying tapes that do not work. Okay, that's type 1. Type 2 says, you quit making the tapes, even though they could help people. So, what's the goal of your company? Make money. So, which one do you think that you would prefer gets made? Type 1, because people will waste their money buying your tape, and you will make money, even though they don't do anything. Okay, so, here we go. If you were the marketing director of the company that sells, which type would you prefer to be made? Heck yeah, I want a type 1 error to work because I'm selling nothing and getting money for it. Okay, we will stop there. And we'll probably do this example 3 tomorrow and then play a game with this because this is some deep thinking.